everyone, to Middays. Rocking into the afternoon on this
Hump Day.
Joining us now in the Element Wealth Studios, Brad White, the Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Transportation. Brad, good to see you again, my friend.
Thank you. Always good to be with you.
Yes, sir. Thanks for coming in. So we had Commissioner Caldwell on last week. He is the Northern District Commissioner, Transportation Commissioner. And so I thought it might be of some value if you'd start out, Brad, by just describing the funding model for the Department of Transportation. From where does the money come? Because it's a combination of federal and state money. And how do taxpayers actually pay for our roads and bridges and infrastructure? Where does that come from? And also just to again, clarify the distinction between the general fund and how the legislature is responsible for that in determining where that money is spent and how that money is appropriated, and of course the source of those revenues. But there's a pretty hard line between the general fund, I think that's often not understood, and the highway fund, the state highway fund.
Right. And
then of course you got federal money that goes directly to DOTD. So they're fairly separate. I mean, there's oversight, there's some integration, but there's a good deal of separation between those as well from an economic perspective.
Right. Well, MDOT is probably the state's largest special fund agency, and by and large we're funded with the proceeds of fuel tax that's collected around the state. And there are a few other taxes and fees that we get that factor into that, but by and large we operate by the fuel tax, or have in the past. And as you mentioned, it's a cooperation between us and the federal government. We implement the Federal Highway Administration's program. And so every 5 years, Congress reauthorizes Federal Highway Administration to conduct business with their partners in the 50 states and the territories and places around the country. And that's where it's identified how many federal dollars we'll be getting. This last session, or the last reauthorization that Federal Highway had, there was an increase. For the last 5-year authorization, I think we had somewhere in about $2.5 billion over 5 years. They increased that to $3.3 billion over 5 years. And then there were some additional programs that we'll be implementing that deal with electric vehicle charging stations, an additional bridge program that will be very helpful to the state. And then the way the construction works, though, is that money, the federal dollars, never comes to Mississippi and sits in a bank for us to spend out. The commission lets projects. Federal Highway is our partner from the beginning of these projects all the way through the planning, the pre-construction phases, and then the construction phase. As they are satisfied that the department is spending money in conjunction and following their rules and regulations, then they reimburse us their percentage, and depending on the project, it can be 80% or 90%.
I got you.
For what we're expending. So we use the state fuel tax money and our state dollars to implement every project at 100%, hoping that we do it right to get all of the federal participation to reimburse us with that. What we've seen over the last, and you're familiar with this through MEC and others, over the last few years is as revenue declined, as vehicles were becoming more efficient, fuel tax was not providing enough money in order for the department to keep up with the needs around the state. So a decision had to be made on how do you fund that, and the legislature has really stepped up over the last few years, going with the previous term as well as now, in providing other mechanisms that are not necessarily special funds that can help erase that funding gap that the department's had in the past. Mm-hmm. Obviously, one is $80 million a year that we get from the lottery proceeds that come in. Those are primarily spent now on rehabilitating 2-lane highways around the state. I think we've rehabilitated since the implementation of the lottery somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,500 lane miles around the state with those dollars. And this past session, I thought the legislature gave the Department of Transportation probably the best session we've had in a long time. They did a lot of things that I think are deserving of praise. One is they gave us somewhere in the neighborhood of about $230 $30 million above from the general fund appropriation to the department to help supplement our budget.
Okay.
$40 million of that will be used to make sure that we're putting up the match dollars in order to receive all of the extra federal dollars that would be made available to us through the IIJA. They gave us an additional $45 million to help supplement the pavement maintenance program around the state, another $35 million to help supplement the capacity program around the state, and then another $100 million to do the Emergency Road and Bridge program that will be spent on local bridges and road needs around the state. So we are in financially probably one of the better positions we've been in. We'll have a budget of about $1.35 billion over the next year, and with much comes much responsibility. So now we've got the responsibility of making sure we get the work done. Unfortunately, we find ourselves at a time with the economy where I'm hopeful that, this money is able to go to more use than just trying to cover the cost of inflation. Material costs, fuel costs have gone up, and that's not just with us, but with the contractors that we have to use.
Yeah.
So projects are going to cost more. But the support that we receive from the legislature and the additional money from Congress will allow us to overcome those challenges and hopefully be able to get these projects out and to better serve the people of Mississippi.
Is this a typical situation, Brad, where the legislature, as part of their appropriations and their funding, allocates a fair amount of money to DOTD? Is that typical on an annual basis?
I would say that's atypical.
I would too.
I mean, the legislature has a responsibility of giving us the authority to spend the state dollars in order to engage with the Federal Highway Administration and carry out those programs. But the lottery program was probably one of the newer programs. The Emergency Road and Bridge Relief Program was new. And then obviously this direct appropriation into the department that they gave us this time to support those programs is the first time in my knowledge.
I think it's a function of just having excess revenues, wouldn't you think?
But they worked with us very well, because I think the best thing that the legislature did for the department really had nothing to do with the extra money they gave us, but they did not earmark our federal program. So our bill had zero earmarks in it, where the legislature would tell us we want to spend $500,000 here and $250 here. And the importance of that is that allows us to make maximum benefit or take maximum advantage of the federal dollars made available to us. We have full flexibility. So them recognizing that tool that they could give us, to me, was one of the biggest things that they gave us, better than even the money. And then in addition to that, they gave us the authority to readjust our salaries within the department, because hiring people losing people was becoming a real problem. And with an agency like ours, we're having to rely a lot on the private sector to help support us in what we're doing. And they're very good at doing that, but we find that consultants sometimes can cost about 3-to-1 ratio of what it could do if we did it on our own. So being able to stop the hemorrhaging of valuable employees and then being in a position to recruit more engineers, more maintenance workers, I think will better position us to be able to tend to the taxpayers' needs and to do it more efficiently and cost effectively over time. So to me, those were the two things the legislature did that were most praiseworthy, but we obviously we appreciate all the extra money as well.
Makes total sense. So one of the things that Commissioner Caldwell talked about last week, Brad, was that he was disappointed in, is the way he described it, was he was seeking for the legislature to provide some funding that would cover the outstanding debt, some of the bond debt that's currently on the books at DOTD, and in doing so would free that money that the DOTD is currently expending to cover their debt service on infrastructure projects.
Right.
Explain that.
So several years ago, under Butch Brown, when he was the director, MDOT had the law change that would allow the commission to have the authority to enter into a memorandum of agreement with a local government entity, to where if there was a project on our system that we wanted to do, that the local government could then issue bonds that would pay for the project, and then we in turn would agree as a department to meet the debt service of those bonds, pay them back. And that racked up, I think they issued about $900 and something million worth of bonds over, I don't know, about 20 years. And the debt service to those is what the commissioner was hoping that they would pay off. But I can explain more about that.
Hang on. We got a break right here. We'll come back. We've got Brad White, Executive Director of MDOT, in the Element Wealth Studios. In the Element Wealth Studios, Brad White is our guest. He is the Executive Director of MDOT. MDOT on the C-Spire text line, $80 million for Mississippi Lottery. Yeah, exactly. And that is, and Brad mentioned that. That's part of the funding received. That goes straight into the state highway fund, never passes through the legislature. It actually gets transferred to the treasurer, the state treasurer, who then deposits it in accordance with law into the state highway fund. And that is the first $80 million of net proceeds generated by the lottery on an annual fiscal year basis. And for the first 2 full fiscal years of operations of the lottery, that being 2020, 2021, and now into 22, we're going to hit that. We're going to hit those numbers. Yeah. So, I mean, it's already been achieved.
That raises a good point that's worthy of saying. The legislature, going back to the creation of the lottery fund and ERBR, as well as the appropriations we received today or this past session, they did a phenomenal job in making sure that all of that money goes directly to projects.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's all dedicated to roads and bridges. All of those dollars are.
I think, Brad, you could argue that it was because of the inability to get fuel tax increase through the legislatures, why Governor Phil Bryant saw that as an opportunity to call a special session and establish a lottery, but have the proceeds go unusually, because we're one of the few states, if not the only state, that actually takes the majority of their lottery proceeds and allocates it to road and bridge infrastructure.
Right. Well, it is a core function of government, and we can discuss all day long how we want to fund that, and I think that's a discussion that we need to be having because there's certainly some ways are better than others, but it is something that requires to be funded so that we can provide that service to our state.
So to those, Brad, who say, well, the DOTD is not running in tip-top shape in terms of efficiency and there's work to be done to really optimize and leverage the assets and the funding, I know you've spent a lot of time on this since you've been in place as the executive director. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's like anything else. There's always room for improvement.
Sure.
And our team are always looking at ways that we can do things better. I've been meeting just in the last few weeks a lot with our partners in the private industry to be sure that our communication is open between one another to find ways to continually be improving the manner in which we do work.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest things I would point to defend MDOT's record is we pass all of our audits. I mean, every time we've had everything from peer investigations to the state auditor to private auditing firms that have been hired to review what MDOT has done in years past, and MDOT's always passed with flying colors.
Yep.
The other thing I would point to is that our team does a phenomenal job in making sure that all of the federal dollars that are made available to us are obligated and spent here in Mississippi. And the best way to prove that, or there are other states that don't, and at the end of the federal fiscal year, we're able to take advantage by that redistribution of funds that other states were not able to take advantage of, that we're able to bring to Mississippi and use. So our team does a very good job of making sure that we're leveraging every dollar that we can to improve the transportation system of our state. But we were talking at the time we went off about the bonds, and I want to go back to that.
Yeah.
We have not taken part in that program for many years now. In this past session, the legislature took the step to remove the commission's authority to even enter into such an agreement
with the municipalities
in the future.
Yeah.
And when that bill was going through, there was some discussion about whether or not it made sense with the surplus money that the state had to pay that debt off so that the money that we use in our budget to service the debt could then go back to construction.
Right.
And ultimately, because the federal government participates in paying that off, it was decided that there was would not have been the best financial use of those funds, and that we would just remove the ability to add any more debt to that. And then we would continue scheduling, the payments out, and hopefully in the next 20 years, that'll be paid off. But those amounts will go down considerably over the years. But what the commissioner was talking about was that was $70 million a year right now that could have been put somewhere else had it been paid off.
Gotcha.
ultimately it was determined that that wasn't a best use of the money that the state had available to them, and I understand that and support that thought.
Yeah. I have been to meetings, gatherings where I've seen you speak, and one of the things you always do a great job of is explaining how the department goes about prioritizing projects and the system and the methodology that you employ to determine when it's time to rework or improve or however you describe it, renovate. Right. Particular roads and bridges, that it's not something that is subjective. It's actually fairly objective.
No,
you have some standards involved in that.
It's nothing that I can take credit of. They've been doing this for some time, and it goes back to being data-driven in what we do, making sure that the money is being put where the data would show the needs are. Now, unfortunately, our state has a lot more needs than we have funds. But I think that the legislature's taken appropriate steps to help us escalate the type of assistance that we're trying to get out. But the department has for lack of a better term, a committee or a team that's made up of some of our people along with employees of Federal Highway Administration that travel the state, that review the pavement and the concrete and the various, do inspections of all of the $46 billion worth of investment the taxpayers have in their transportation system. And then they develop the list that's presented to the commission saying this is where the needs are and this is the order that they need to go in. And if there's some type of natural disaster or some other occurrence that happens that would change that list from one year to the next, it's constantly being amended. As more funds are available, we're able to get further down that list, which I think was the legislature's intent with the money that they gave us. I think the department does a very good job of being able to back up the work we do in the way of rehabilitation with following a data-driven process. So one area of the state's not benefiting over another.
Yeah. There's no secret that we've got to push at the federal level and certainly within the industry itself, the automobile industry, to transition to EVs. And, of course, a great deal, if not most of our funding, right, certainly from the state level, comes from fuel taxes.
Oh, yeah.
So if we're consuming less fuel and we're driving more EVs, it could affect your funding.
Well, and that's the reason that I've always, I guess, been a little weird coming from MDOT and the transportation world in that I don't think that raising the fuel tax is the answer to our problem long term. Mm-hmm. I believe that as vehicles, even those that operate off of fuel, are becoming more and more efficient as the rail industry becomes carrying more goods by rail and other modes like that. The growth of electric vehicles. I mean, we've seen the federal government is pushing very hard to incentivize that nationwide, as well as moving the federal fleet. Automobile manufacturers moving towards that. I don't believe the fuel tax will be a sustainable source of income for our department long term. So I'm hoping that this summer we can have some legislative hearings to where we start looking at how do we want to fund this core function of government in a responsible manner that can be a dedicated stream of revenue that we can count on.
Yeah. I just saw yesterday, I believe, that Ford introduced their Lightning F-150. Right. It's the top-selling vehicle in the country, and they sold out of what they intend to make before they ever started making any of it. It's 200,000, I think, they sold out. So it's certainly not today, but it's coming, and you're aware of it.
More of that with the, a portion of the infrastructure money we receive from Congress will go to develop these electric vehicle charging station corridors, which will start on the interstates and some of the four-lane highways to try to develop these corridors and connectivity across the nation. Yeah. And as soon as people can relieve themselves of that concern of the battery running out, I guess you'd say, I think you're going to see a real uptick in the purchase of those type of vehicles.
So you and I were talking offline, this bipartisan infrastructure bill, $1.2 trillion that was passed, I think some $300-400 billion dedicated specifically to road and bridge infrastructure. And something I shared on the air last week, Brad, is that the Biden administration has reversed course on the Trump administration and reinstated, is it NEPA? I think it's what it's called, the environmental policy, something or another. And anyhow, a very stringent, very onerous set of rules that bureaucrats are going to be overseeing that might make getting these projects off the ground really difficult, the bar quite high.
the big concerns that we're watching right now is, one, obviously the inflation that we're experiencing, the rising cost of fuel, the rising cost of materials, the availability of materials and being able to get them trucked into the projects. I mean, we're facing that. Our partners in the private sector are facing it, and it's impacting our ability to do projects. But also, overregulation is a huge issue. We want to be left alone. We want to be able to deal with our state's needs as our data will back up in conjunction with our local Federal Highway Administration, and not be told by Washington where we need to put the money.
I totally agree. Hopefully we can flip the White House and reverse that EO and go back to the Trump era standards, because we're still going to be spending this money and working on these projects 2 years from now.
Well, it's a pendulum that normally swings.
Exactly right. Brad White is the Executive Director of MDOT. We appreciate you coming in, Brad.
Thank you very much for having me.
You bet.